In Vladimir Putin's rambling war declaration on Thursday morning, he threw everything at the wall in hopes something might stick. He didn't just cite the Iraq war, the Balkans, the US intervention in Syria. He didn't just perform his usual rewriting of history, claiming Ukrainian land is Russian land. He also said this, and I quote, "We will seek to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine." Later, he addressed Ukrainian soldiers directly, saying, quote, "Your fathers, grandfathers, and great-grandfathers did not fight the Nazi occupiers and did not defend our common motherland to allow today's neo-Nazis to seize power in Ukraine." All of which seems awfully weird since Ukraine is not a Nazi country. So what in the world is Vladimir Putin going on about? Well, it's part of a Russian propaganda narrative, one that's long found currency among the American far right and parts of the far left. A lie told in bad faith, but one that almost a decade ago held a sliver of truth. It started in 2014 when Ukrainian demonstrators forced the Russian-aligned president, Viktor Yanukovych, to flee the country. Putin responded by invading and backing Russian separatists across Ukraine. And in the fighting, far-right fringe militias joined other Ukrainian elements to defend their homeland. Chief among them was the Azov Battalion, a paramilitary formed by, yes, neo-Nazis. But other far-right groups came and went too, with names like Right Sector, Patriot of Ukraine, and White Hammer. Few made much of an impact on the fighting or on Ukrainian society. But even back then, Putin was falsely claiming that the neo-Nazi groups ran Ukraine. Never mind the fact that in Ukraine's most recent election in 2019, the country's ultra-nationalist far-right coalition gained just over 2% of the vote and 0 seats in parliament. These guys don't run anything in Ukraine, with one notable exception. The Azov Battalion still enjoys status as a National Guard unit, one that US and Canadian militaries refuse to work with when they're training Ukrainian troops. In fact, you may have seen them recently in viral photos showing Azov soldiers training regular Ukrainians, including a grandmother, for possible insurgency fighting against Russian invaders. The vast majority of Ukrainians have little in common with Azov's extremists, but with the constant threat of Russian invasion, they don't mind the hell. That's according to Michael Colborn, a Bellingcat researcher who literally wrote the book on Azov. This week he told the Israeli paper Haaretz that if you ask Ukrainians what do they think of Azov's politics, or mention that they are far-right extremists, many people will say, I don't really care about that. I don't share those views. I'm more interested in what they can do to defend Ukraine. That's disconcerting, but also on some level, understandable. If there were a foreign state invasion of the American mainland, a lot of armed US liberals might suddenly find themselves shoulder to shoulder with Proud Boys on the ramparts. Then again, maybe not if the invading force was Russia.
We probably don't want to be rubbing shoulders with organized far-right militant groups that have, that are very open about it. I mean, you could go right now and view on YouTube their videos of their trainings. They're very forward symbolism. They're not hiding this stuff.
Canadian diplomats and soldiers in Ukraine took an unusual meeting in June of 2018, one that's now coming to light. It was a meeting with one of the paramilitary units raised to fight off the Russian invasion of Ukraine's eastern provinces. One problem, that unit, the Azov Battalion, has been linked to neo-Nazism, and the Canadian military knew.
Велику, могутню і соборну. Слава нації!
An Ottawa Citizen report says Canadian forces in Ukraine produced a briefing in 2017 saying members of the Azov Battalion identified themselves as Nazis. But the June 2018 meeting happened anyway, with a Canadian forces colonel and diplomatic staff attending. The battalion published pictures on social media saying Canadian representatives expressed their hopes for, quote, further fruitful cooperation. In a statement, the Department of National Defense says they are strongly opposed to the glorification of Nazism and all forms of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, intolerance, and extremism, adding, our official position remains that we are not, nor will we be providing support to Azov and affiliated entities. Brad Galloway with the Center for Hate, Bias, and Extremism has studied the Azov Battalion. He says that while some neo-Nazi groups prefer to be discreet with their imagery, the Azov Battalion is more forthright. German news found members of the unit sporting SS symbols and swastikas, and Azov prominently places the wolf's hook and black sun, two symbols favored by the Nazis on its crest.
Maybe there's a wing of them that want to tone it down a little bit so it's playable in North America. You know, that could be one aspect of it. But I think with the way they're doing things over in Europe, I think it's as advertised.
Galloway says what concerns him most is the Canadian government underestimating the reach of groups like the Azov Battalion. Similar to Canadians who join ISIS, Galloway warns that alienated far-right Canadians may see the Azov Battalion as a chance to turn ideology into action.
Some risk I see is that guys giving up on the movement in North America and saying, well, we should organize and go to Eastern Europe where we can actually do something, we can make a difference. And that's I think a huge risk.
In Ottawa, Shaoli Lee, City News.
It seemed like an odd way to spend a Saturday, watching the blood sports at a festival for far-right extremists. This was the summer of 2019, and I'd gone to Ukraine to learn more about these groups. From the crowds, one thing seemed pretty clear about them. They weren't bothered by the fact that this event was organized by the Azov movement, a far-right group that has increasingly been linked to violence around the world.
The shooter is linked to a 74-page manifesto filled with white supremacist rhetoric.
FBI agents say he expressed a desire to travel to Ukraine to fight with a far-right paramilitary group.
At least one member of an American hate group also trained in Ukraine, with Azov Battalion.
According to the FBI, domestic terrorists killed 39 people in fiscal year 2019, making it the most deadly year for domestic terrorism since the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing.
The threat of white nationalism has evolved since Oklahoma City, where a domestic terrorist used a truck bomb to kill at least 168 people. Police don't tend to see such terrorists as lone wolves acting in isolation anymore. It's become clear to law enforcement that these attackers often have links to a global network, one with common goals and a shared ideology.
We are looking very hard at white supremacists or neo-Nazis here, connecting through social media online with like-minded individuals overseas, and in some cases actually traveling overseas to train.
Over the last few years, experts in violent extremism have grown especially alarmed about the Azov movement. The group emerged from the revolution that swept across Ukraine in 2014, and it has gotten a lot stronger amid the ongoing war with pro-Russian forces in eastern Ukraine. The fighting in that region has become kind of ideal breeding ground for militias like Azov. At their public events, one thing that surprised me was how many Ukrainians tend to see Azov not as militants or extremists, but as war heroes. In Kiev, the capital, I watched an Independence Day parade where veterans of the Azov Battalion marched alongside other volunteer militias, surrounded by cheering crowds, who thanked them for defending Ukraine against Russia. But even at the march, there were signs of the far-right ideology that's so common inside Azov. The symbols on their flags have been especially controversial. Azov says it combines the letters I and N for idea of nation, but extremism experts see it as an emblem of Nazism.
The official symbol of Azov, it's a version of Volksangel. It was one of the symbols of one of SS division during the World War II. It is one of more or less usual symbols for neo-Nazi groups all over the world.
And it's not just about their symbols. When it was founded in 2014, Azov drew many of its commanders and recruits from Ukraine's most notorious far-right groups, including outright neo-Nazis.
We basically recruited everyone who could hold weapons in their hand when the Ukrainian state was paralyzed and the defense of the Ukrainian state was totally in the hand of Ukrainian volunteers. So there were many war adventurers, guys who believed that they are on a kind of ideological tour to save maybe the future of the West and so on and so forth.
So the future of the white race?
Or, yes.
Azov's paramilitary wing is now a major fighting force, with its own bases and training grounds near the front lines of the war against pro-Russian forces. After the Veterans Parade in Kiev, I interviewed Andrei Beletsky, who founded the Azov movement in 2014.
Воинское братство – это люди, которые не просто служили вместе, вместе проливали кровь, переживали гибель товарищей, сладость побед, охраны общественного порядка на улице. Мы создаем отряды самообороны, которые помогают поддерживать порядок на улицах.
Azov's leaders have also tried to break into politics. They failed to win any seats in parliament during the most recent elections in 2019, but their plans in Ukraine are ambitious.
Сьогодні ми відпочиваємо, але навіть відпочиваючи, ми пропагуємо наші нові українські цінності. Бути сильними і сміливими, бути єдиними і відчувати братерство своєї нації.
What worries officials in the West is Azov's recruitment strategy. It's tried hard to build friendships with far-right groups around the world, especially in the US and Europe. During my visit in 2019, I spent a day at one of the biggest recruitment events in Azov's history. Thousands of people showed up for a day of fighting sports and blatant propaganda. There were neo-Nazi symbols, tattoos, and posters all over the place. And many in the crowd seemed pretty receptive to Azov's far-right ideology.
Бути толерантним про ЛГБТшникам – це неприродне. Для цього треба людині промити мозки. Поважати своїх батьків, любити своїх дітей, пишатися за свою країну – це нормально.
Events like this also tend to attract recruits from abroad. One of the ones I met was named Robin, who had just arrived in Ukraine from Sweden, where he told me he's wanted for hate crimes.
This is hard to explain the surroundings for someone who's watching this, you know. It's surreal. It's like, I don't know, it's like something you read about the great Germany before, you know, in the 1920s. It's a revival of the Indo-European soul. Mm-hmm. And it's all happening here in Ukraine.
Afterward, we rode back to the Azov base in northern Kyiv, where Azov commanders had allowed Robin to stay as a potential recruit.
We are Aryans, and we will rise again. That's a way of life, you know. And after the war in Germany, we went back to the benches, school benches. But now we will rise again.
Are they neo-Nazis as an organization? No. Have they had neo-Nazis in their organization? I would say look at the U.S. Army, and you would find neo-Nazis as well.
Dave is an American expat and U.S. military veteran who has volunteered to help Ukraine's National Guard. And he's met a lot of the recruits who'd come to join Azov.
You only need one of these guys to kind of go home and commit an act of terrorism to then really damage the reputation of Ukraine in the eyes of the world, right? So that's really a risk that Ukraine faces. Do you think they're taking it seriously enough?
No, yes.
A few weeks later, Robin, the Swede I met at that festival, wrote me that he was going to the front lines to join the fight. With recruits like this, it's little wonder that US officials see Azov as a threat. Experts point out that the pace of white supremacist terrorism has intensified, with new incidents frequently filling the headlines. 22 gunned down at a Walmart in El Paso, Texas, 2 killed near a synagogue in Halle, Germany, 9 more in an attack on 2 shisha bars near Frankfurt, and a series of arrests exposing far-right terror plots across the US and Europe. One tally reported an increase of 320% in such attacks in Western countries between 2014 and 2019.
Я знаю, я вірю, я переконаний, що ми готові до боротьби, що ми готові бути сміливими і сильними, що ми готові перемагати. Бо за нами Україна, а перед нами наша остаточна велика перемога. Слава Україні! Героям слава! Слава нації! Смерть ворогам! Україна! Понад усе! Україна! Понад усе! Україна! Понад усе!
The National Militia are part of a group called Azov. Initially a volunteer military battalion, it has well-established links to the far right. Its founder, this man Andrei Beletsky, has in the past expressed racist and anti-Semitic views. And its logo has clear Nazi overtones.
My favorite quote from Andrei Beletsky is that the destiny of the Ukrainian nation is to be an avant-garde in holy war of white people against underhumans led by Semites.
Beletsky now denies he ever said that, but as this oath-making ceremony shows, he's not running away from the dubious imagery. Azov has now started a political party, as well as launching the national militia. The toxic racism has, in public at least, been replaced by patriotic nationalism.
Do you now reject those values that you had in the past?
Багато води витекло з того часу. Багато чого змінилося в країні. Ми декларували завжди законні вимоги, законні бажання в управлінні державою корінного населення, управління державою.
Is it ever okay to use violence to achieve your aims?
Коли особа намагається придушити або подавити волю народу з допомогою правоохоронних органів, частних армій чи якихось інших структурних, неструктурних підрозділів, тоді народ має право витребувати навіть в силовій боротьбі своє право назад.
The national militia have already been flexing their muscles in Ukrainian politics. This is the city hall in the town of Cherkasy. Look at it now. All round the outside are security officers. There are more police here today than there are representatives. And the reason the police have come is because at the last session, this happened. The National Militia, together with some war veterans, turned up and stood among the deputies, announcing that no one would leave until the mayor's budget was passed.
Що ти проти? Що ти проти? Давайте працювати! Давайте почати!
After some scuffles and angry exchanges,
Чого мовчи? Бо язик засунув собі! Що ти не...
the budget was passed.
Зараз Черкаси стало тренувальним майданчиком для військового перевороту в Україні.
Alarmist? Perhaps, but many people, not just in Cherkasy, are wondering whether the national militia are being mobilized as part of a bigger political play.
Без погодження МВД, то такого існувати в Україні не може. Якщо Аваков прийме рішення для себе, що таким чином національна дружина, яка вона є зараз, не може існувати, де люди ходять в балаклавах, де люди ходять у військовій формі, то я думаю, це питання буде рішено.
This is him, Arsen Avakov, Ukraine's ambitious interior minister. His links to the Azov group are well known. He's put their fighters on the payroll of his ministry and appointed one of their commanders, Vadim Troyan, as his deputy. Mr. Avakov declined our interview request, but his spokesman told us he believed the national militia was simply running a very effective publicity campaign.
Please look at us. We are so strong. We are so serious. Believe me, it's not a truth. If the groups are operating not going against the law.
But they are going against the law.
Please,
they're smashing places up.
No, only one smash. It's one smash.
No, we've seen them
fighting.
smashing up lots of different places. We've seen them fighting with the police a number of times. They've intimidated politicians. That's not okay, is it?
I agree with you absolutely. And that time they are under interrogation, and after that, if we have the proofs, under the criminal cases, under investigation.
But the fact that you're not doing anything just fuels the idea that the Minister of the Interior is somehow behind or supporting this group.
No, it's not the truth. I wanted to say that people that they are following by the political fakes, inspired by maybe by political opponents of ministry.
The national militia may well be the extreme right's first move ahead of Ukraine's elections next year. But it's the uncertainty over who's behind them that's worrying people. Confidence in politicians and the police here is low, and for whatever reason, the national militia appear to have been given the nod to act outside the law.
Це абсолютний хаос. У нас немає на що спиратись. Наша країна розвалюється. У нас немає порядку. Тому ми і стоїмо на засадах безпосереднього порядку, українського порядку.
Як історія, вона повторюється, якщо ми подивимося, що відбувалося в Германії там 37-39 рік, да, коли воно фашизм тоді піднімався, то в принципі можна, я б їх цим самим зрівняв.
It's an apocalyptic warning. But it's a reminder that 4 years after Ukraine turned away from Russia towards Europe, the struggle for its soul is far from over.
With smoke bombs and drums, some 3,000 members of Ukraine's nationalist Azov battalion marched through the capital, Kyiv. In a show of force, they lit flares outside the parliament building. It was a warning to the government against making any potential deal that would lead to elections in separatist-controlled territory of eastern Ukraine. The Azov battalion was formed in 2014 to fight Russia-backed separatists in Ukraine's east and is now part of the Interior Ministry's National Guard. They also called for Ukraine's borders to be fully restored. The battalion's leader vowed there would be more protests outside parliament if the government failed to heed their warnings.